Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out this evening. Initially, I'd like to welcome or to commend the sponsors of this week, the Africana Studies Program, Brothers on a New Direction, Center for Nonviolence and Peace Studies, thank heavens for the collaboration there, the Center for Student Leadership Development, Cognitive Dissidence, the Department of Education, the Department of Communication Studies, the Department of Psychology, and the Department of Kinesiology should be on here too. The Feinstein Center for Service Learning. Jonathan Lewis is here today from The Gathering. The Gay, Lesbian, Bisexual, and Transgender Center. The Hillel Foundation. InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. Jumpstart URI, Latin American Student Association, Multicultural Center, NAACP, Office of the Chaplains, Office of Community Diversity and Equity, Office of Greek Affairs, Office of Housing and Residential Life, Office of the President, Printing Services, Pink Women, Sankofa, SAWA, that's Student Alliance for the Welfare of Africa, Science and Math Investigative Learning Experiences, otherwise known as the SMILE program, Student Affairs Diversity Fund, and Uhuru Sasa. And if we've omitted anyone from that, it is an oversight, and please hold me only responsible for that. Just very briefly, I'd like to mention that the topic of economic inequality is, of course, at the very top of the agenda for our nation now, at least from the perspective of the Occupy movement. Many of us from a different generation, from a generation where we were contemporaries with Dr. King, remember the emphasis in the later King years toward income inequality. Some of Dr. King's strongest language was regarding the gap, as he saw it, between the poor and the others. So one of his comments, Congress appropriates military funds with alacrity and generosity. It appropriates poverty funds with miserliness and grudging reluctance. The government is emotionally committed to the war, meaning the Vietnam War. It is emotionally hostile to the needs of the poor. And another comment, a brief comment. We must develop a federal program of public works, retraining, and jobs for all, so that none, white or black, will have cause to feel threatened. There is nothing except short-sightedness to prevent us from guaranteeing an annual minimum and livable income for every American family. So that gives you pause. What Dr. King was focusing on at this time was the relationship or the gap between poor and the rest. Now, because middle-class people have difficulty aspiring to own a home or to pay health care expenses or to have a job, a decent, livable wage job. So now then, the people who I thought, at least in my generation, that I would never have to think about these things. But the gap is so enormous now that it includes many, many more. And certainly many of us in this room consider ourselves then a part of the 99%. At this time, I'd like to just acknowledge a few people. I'm going to ask them all to stand, and please hold your applause until they stand. I'd like to acknowledge Reverend Lynn Dooley. Would you please stand, Lynn? Vice President Tom Dugan of Student Affairs, Dean of the Graduate School, Dr. Nasser Zawiya, and of course our good friend, the Provost of the University at this time. And so would you give all of them a round of applause? So at this time, I'd like to present our two MCs for the evening, Francisco Vargas and Tyler Curry.
Hello, everyone. I'm Tyler Curry. I'm a junior at the University of Rhode Island, and I'm studying journalism and communication studies.
Hello, and I'm Francisco Vargas. I'm a junior and film major here at the University of Rhode Island.
And I would just like to say thank you everyone so much for coming out today to commemorate the legacy that Dr. King has left behind with us. Since grade school, my generation has been taught the discourse of Dr. King's legacy and his efforts in the civil rights movement. But how many of us find a personal affinity with Dr. King's efforts? So, Francisco, how do you personally identify with Dr. King?
Thank you for asking, Tyler. Well, one great memory I had from high school was a conversation I had with my teacher, and he said that the moment Martin Luther King died was the moment that America lost its leader in multicultural society. Now, I would like to kind of disagree with that because I believe that Martin Luther King lives through his legacy and with the accomplishments and achievements of others. He stands the test of time because we represent our own leadership and our own struggles that we go through.
Well, I agree with that, Francisco. How he's personally affected me is that I know that I can fight for justice. It's something that I don't see as equal whenever I see injustice. And even at the most fundamental level, I know that as a biracial woman in today's society, I am equal to everyone else in this room, in this country, in this world, because Dr. King has instilled that notion into my head. And it seems customary, but people that came before me, they might not, before Dr. King even, they may not have felt as entitled to that equality as I do now, and I'm very thankful for that. And that's why we're here today, to thank and commemorate and celebrate Dr. King, an individual who made sure that everybody felt equal opportunity.
Well, now I would like to take the time to introduce Amy Olson, Executive Director of Hillel and the Chair of URI Chaplains Association, to present the MLK Peacemaker Award.
Thank you very much. The URI Chaplains Association is a body of religious professionals at the University of Rhode Island who, in addition to serving their own faith communities, work together to foster dialogue, understanding, and respect among people of different faiths and traditions. I'd like to invite the members of the Chaplains Association who are here today to rise. I'll introduce you to them. We have Lynn Baker Dooley, Joanne Friday, and Joey Schwartz-Magnone. And the Chaplains Association at URI is made up of representations from the Protestant, Catholic, Buddhist, Muslim, Jewish, and Orthodox traditions, and has contacts with other traditions throughout the state, even if they're not represented here on campus. Each year, the Chaplains Association has the honor of awarding the URI Chaplains Martin Luther King Jr. Peacemaker Award to the individual student or URI student group who best exemplifies the values and aspirations of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and works to implement those visions on campus. Dr. King's principles of nonviolence include seeking to win friendship and understanding with an end result of redemption and reconciliation, seeking to defeat injustice, not people, seeking transformative and educational possibilities in suffering, accepting the consequences of one's acts, choosing love instead of hate, activity, not passivity, seeing all life as interrelated, having deep faith that the universe is on the side of justice, and eventually justice will prevail. This year we are honoring an individual and a student group who have certainly lived up to and demonstrated those principles at URI. Branford Davis, come on down.
He's running out of class right now. I just talked to him.
Oh, he's on the way?
Just get out of class.
Oh! All right, talk amongst yourselves. Perfect timing.
I apologize, I had a class.
Branford Davis is a super senior, and that does not just refer to the fact that he is completing a second bachelor's degree this year after completing a first degree last year. Branford has indeed been super in his commitment to diversity and multiculturalism at URI. He does not just talk the talk, but walks the walk, literally. Last spring, Branford organized the Stop the Hate March, where dozens of URI students, faculty, and staff marched in solidarity through campus on one of the wettest days of the year. I think we're still drying out. Yeah. Branford is the former URI Student Senate Cultural Affairs Chair and founder of the awareness organization Classy Leaders Achieving Student Services, otherwise known as CLASS. Through his work at URI, Branford has developed a unique vision for a multicultural campus in which all students are enabled to learn and develop to their maximum potential. Branford is a Level 1 Kingian nonviolence and peace trainer who had the pleasure of being honored with this accomplishment over the summer here at URI and has subsequently gone on to train others. So we'd like to present the Martin Luther King Jr. Peacemaker Award.
Thank you, everybody.
Our second award goes to the URI LBTQ Women's Group, and specifically the 5 students who were chiefly responsible for the It Gets Better at URI Coming Out for Change video. Their small project, and I put small in quotation marks, which they initially anticipated the participation of a handful of staff and a small number of students, galvanized a tidal wave of support from the highest levels of the administration to staff members on all levels, to faculty across disciplines, and to students of all orientations. The movie's message was clear. The URI community was invested in letting all individuals who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, or questioning to know that there are allies and resources here, and that whatever they are dealing with, there are people here willing to work to make them not feel alone and to understand that it can get better. Dr. King would have supported the group's way of fighting intolerance, not by targeting the narrow-minded perpetrators of hate, but by highlighting the positive, healing energy that can exist in our society and on our campus. Accepting the award for the LBTQ Women's Group, I'm going to read all 5 names of the women who were chiefly participatory in this, although only 2 are here today because 2 are in class and 1 has graduated. Today, we have here with us Jennifer Kay and Kimberly McGinnis, and the other ladies are Portia Burnett, Christina Kinney, and Dana Spiesler. So will Kim and Jen come forward, please? photographer is here. Where's the photographer? Oh, actually, hold on one second.
There you go.
We also want to acknowledge their advisors, Holly Nichols, Anne Marie Vaccaro, and the director of the Women's Center, Carolyn Sauvé. And if one of you would like to step forward to claim the general plaque.
Thank you, Amy.
All right, that will do the picture.
Let's get one more. Come over here. This way. Away from the. Okay. There you go. Good.
Thank you very much.
At this time, I would like to introduce Dr. Paul Bueno de Mesquita, Director of the Center for Nonviolence and Peace Studies.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. Hello. Hey. Remember, when we talk about Dr. King and our King holiday, we're talking about remembering King and celebrating and taking service actions. So we don't want to forget the celebration, because that's part of what we're doing here today. Thank you very much to Melvin, the organizers of the luncheon today, Mei Lee, and the staff here. It's always a great event on the campus. I want to say what a wonderful experience it is working with the Center for Nonviolence and Peace Studies here at URI over the last 3 years. And one of the great aspects of having this experience for me is meeting all of the fascinating and wonderful people from all over the U.S. and really around the world now at the international level who are doing some incredible work on behalf of promoting peace and nonviolence, and often in many challenging conflict regions in the world. It's really a pleasure to introduce one of those people that I've met over the last few years to you today, Kazuhito Haga, or as we know, Kazu Haga. Kazu moved to the United States from his homeland of Japan as a child at the age of 7. He was introduced to social justice work at age 17 when he participated in an interfaith pilgrimage of the Middle Passage. This was a walking journey to retrace the slave trade routes. He has since been involved with many organizations throughout the U.S. and abroad in a variety of capacities. In 2007, he served as the National Convention Coordinator for the Gathering for Justice's first national gathering meeting, where he was introduced to the philosophy of Kingian nonviolence. Kazu has worked at the Peace Development Fund since 2002, where he currently serves as Program Director. He is also the co-founder and co-director of Communities United for Restorative Youth Justice and sits on the steering committee of the Bay Area Justice Funders Network. Most recently, his activism has led him to become involved with the Positive Peace Warrior Network, a network established by a URI alum, Jonathan Lewis, that we're very proud of. Jonathan and his work over many years promoting nonviolence and actively training hundreds, if not thousands, of people in the U.S. and in Nigeria, I know, over the last few years. Most recently, Kazu has been active in the Occupy movement in Oakland. His involvement with Occupy Oakland has been to bring the voice of nonviolence and peaceful protest to these demonstrations through his leadership, education, and training. He was just sharing with me that they're planning a couple of large trainings there in the upcoming weeks. In this training and leadership activity, he's guided by his Kingian nonviolence perspectives. We're proud to say that many of those perspectives were gained here at the University of Rhode Island in our Summer Institute certification program. He completed his Level 1 certification here in 2009 and then returned to complete our advanced Level 2 leadership certification program in Kingian nonviolence in 2010, and then came back last year to serve as a volunteer and a mentor to some of our trainees. It's really a pleasure to bring him here to share his current work with you on the forefront of some of the most important social change movements and activities going on in the U.S. And so I'll present to you now Kazu.
Thank you. And thank you for having me here. It's really an honor for me to be here. You know, me being here in this room, it is definitely a homecoming of sorts. I actually used to do nonviolence trainings when I lived in Massachusetts many years ago, about 10 years ago. And after a couple of years of doing it, I actually stepped back from that work. It always felt like there was something missing in what I was teaching back then, and so for many years I wasn't involved with nonviolence work at all. I was working in many different social justice movements and campaigns, but nonviolence specifically was never really part of my thing. Until I took the Kingian nonviolence training, initially with Jonathan Lewis when he came out to Oakland to do a 2-day training, and then I came out here to take the Level 1 in this very room. Actually, I was certified to become a Kingian nonviolence trainer, and it was through my experience in learning about Kingian nonviolence that I really came to understand what nonviolence is and what nonviolence means, what it means to be nonviolent. You know, I think the biggest misconception about nonviolence is that nonviolence simply means to not be violent. And I found out in this room that nonviolence is a whole lot more than that. This past November or October maybe, I was taking a nap outside in my house. And I was woken up by some commotion, and there was a fight going on outside of my window. And I live in a community where, unfortunately, that's not, it's a pretty common thing. So all the yelling, I was actually just trying to go back to sleep, because I very rarely get the opportunity to take a nap, so I was just trying to fall back to sleep. But this conflict kept escalating, and it kept escalating. And by the time I actually got out of my bed and looked out the window, there were 2 women who were fighting each other right outside my window. And one of them was... it was getting really violent. It was getting really ugly, and clearly one of the women actually knew how to fight and knew how to throw a punch. So this other woman was getting beaten pretty bad. And so I put on my clothes, I ran downstairs. By this time they were across the street, ran across the street to break up this fight. And meanwhile, there were about 12, 15 of my neighbors that had gathered outside, and they were just watching this go on. All of my neighbors were being not violent. Right? They were just standing around watching, so they weren't participating in the violence. But they also weren't making a stand to stop what was going on. Right? The violence and the injustice that's happening right in their neighborhood. They were just letting it go by. And that's not how I understand nonviolence, and that's not how King understood nonviolence. Right? Committing to nonviolence means making a commitment to take a stand against violence, and to take a stand against injustice, and to do something about the violence in our neighborhoods and our communities. So the time that I spent literally in this room, it changed my life forever. And so I think the work that the Center for Peace and Nonviolent Studies does here is so important in training so many people to really understand what it means to be nonviolent and to really understand the spirit behind Dr. King's message. There's a guy named Marcus Raskin who once said that the opportunity for revolutionary change happens in the blink of an eye. And if you miss that moment, it's gone. And through my involvement with a lot of campaigns and movements over the years, I find that to be very true. That if we're not able to take advantage of a moment that's presented to us, then that moment disappears very quickly. And I think with the Occupy work, we're still riding that momentum, right? We're still riding that wave. It's still possible for this movement to create radical changes in our society. But I do feel like unless we're able to ground ourselves in certain principles, then we may lose that moment and we may lose that opportunity. Occupy Oakland's been in the news a lot. I'm sure you guys have heard bits and pieces about it. And I've been involved since day one, so I just wanted to offer a quick perspective of some of the things that I've seen in Occupy Oakland and talk a little bit about how I think Dr. King would have viewed this movement as a whole. I want to share with you, if we can get this to work, a quick video that I took of some of the stuff that I saw at Occupy. When Occupy Oakland started, what we had at what was called Frank Ogawa Plaza is now renamed Oscar Grant Plaza. It was incredible. There were like 200 tents. We actually had an overflow park. We had another park at Snow Park where there were tents being popped up there just because we were running out of space. And it was more than a form of direct action. What it was the creation and a manifestation of the vision of the society that we wanted to create. Right? There were tons of people living together, free food for anyone that was there 3 times a day. There were homeless people that were getting involved that was participating in serving the food that was given out. We had an art tent, a music tent, a children's tent, a media tent. We had concerts and street theater going on all the time, different workshops. There was a free school, a library. So the vision that Dr. King had of the beloved community, we weren't just talking about it, we were trying to create it right in front of the steps of City Hall and showing people the type of world that we want to live in. Unfortunately, as you all know, the police did end up evicting us. And that's the moment when Occupy Oakland really hit the national scene, was our response to that. So I just want to share with you a bit of what I saw. This is part of probably a 15-minute video clip that I made out of stuff that I saw, and it's available, the whole thing is available at the website for the Positive Peace Warriors Network, which is positivepeacewarriornetwork.com. But I just want to show you a little bit of it. So this is the night after we were evicted from our camp. And this is in downtown Oakland. And this is the night after that violence in the streets. And this is the following night. And this is a visual that we had for Scott Olson, who we'll talk about a little bit.
Olympic science. I am Scott Olson. I am the 99%. I am Scott Olson.
And so on that evening, Occupy Oakland's General Assembly voted to support a general strike, which happened on November 2nd, I believe. And I want to show just a clip from there. This is the march to the Port of Oakland. And I know there were some newspaper reports that said we had about 7,000 people, and actually the chief of police in Oakland reported that we had about 3,000 people. So if you can see, you can't see the beginning or the end of this march. And if you stood at the beginning of the march, you had to wait for about 45 minutes to see the end of it. And that was the first of at least 3 marches that were about the same size that went to the port. The San Francisco Chronicle actually reported that there were 100,000 people on the streets. And this isn't a national mobilization. This is Oakland and the immediate communities in the Bay Area. So you can turn the light on again if you want. So we've seen it throughout history, if you look at the examples of what happened in the Civil Rights Movement, when there are social movements and the police respond with violence, if we're able to maintain our principles of nonviolence, what that does is it paints a very clear picture of who's right and who's wrong, right? And that image, there were images the night after the first raid of a woman in a wheelchair being surrounded in a gas of tear smoke. And then, of course, what happened to Scott Olson, who, if you don't know, is an Iraq War veteran, who was hit in the head with a tear gas canister, fractured his skull, and is now facing months and months of long recovery. That type of narrative, it paints a very clear picture that we're on the side of justice. And what it does is it helps to wake up the moral conscience of a nation. And that sort of violence, if we're able to commit the principles of nonviolence, it strengthens movements. So as you see, after that night when there were about 1,000 people out in the streets, and what happened to Scott Olson happened, and the tear gas and all that, the next day there were 3,000 people out in the streets. And then within 2 weeks we had 100,000 people, by some accounts. But that evening after the general strike, there was some violence in the streets. After it got dark, there was some property destruction, there was some more conflicts with the police, and this time, people from within the movement also engaged in violence. And you know, there's conversations about who started it. To me, who started it doesn't matter as much as the fact that both sides engaged in acts of violence, right? A lot's happened since the general strike at Occupy Oakland. A lot of it culminating in what happened this past Saturday. Some of you may have heard that a group of about 1,000 people tried to take over a building in Oakland, and more violence broke out. And it seems interesting. I'm not in Oakland right now, but I'm trying to follow the conversation that's happening, and it seems like it's really come to a head, where there's just a lot of people who are just sick of the violence that happens out of Occupy Oakland and want to remain engaged and want to support this movement, but don't want to associate themselves with the types of violence and the property destruction that goes on in our city. I want to remind us of the campaign that Dr. King was working on when he passed away, when he was killed, the Poor People's Campaign. During that campaign, towards the very end of King's life, he was calling on poor people from all over the country of all races to come to DC and start a resurrection city. He was calling on people to come to DC and camp out. And you know, sometimes when we talk about Dr. King, we talk about him in the light of, oh, he was a nice guy that wanted everyone to get along, and one night he had this dream. Right? And that's the extent that we know about King and his philosophies. But let's not forget that King was a radical. Right? When he was talking about Resurrection City, he said that he wanted to have an encampment that, quote, is as dramatic, as dislocative, as attention-getting as the riots without destroying life or property. He was talking about the encampment being there to try to cripple the operation of an oppressive society. Right? He was a radical. King was not afraid of direct action. He was not afraid of radical change. In fact, he called for the radical redistribution of political and economic power. So when we talk about the redistribution of wealth that people in this movement are talking about, King would have supported that message. He would have supported the general principles behind this movement of economic justice, of equality, and of using what some people might consider to be radical tactics. King would have supported that. But of course, as we all know, there's a lot of things happening in this movement that King would not have supported, right? That he would not be supportive of. This whole thing with diversity of tactics. For those that may not know, there's a big debate within all Occupy movements, not just Oakland, about, well, do we commit to nonviolence or do we commit to diversity of tactics? Diversity of tactics is something that Occupy Oakland has officially approved and agreed on, which means that we respect any tactics that autonomous groups may choose to use. All right? One of the problems that I have with the framing of the general debate between nonviolence versus diversity of tactics is it makes the assumption that there isn't an incredible wealth of diversity within nonviolent tactics. Right? So arguing for nonviolence isn't arguing against a diversity of tactics. About 2 weeks ago in San Francisco, we had an event called Occupy Wall Street West, which I thought was a great example of the diversity of nonviolent tactics. People were spread out all throughout San Francisco on a rainy day, again. People were using civil disobedience to shut down banks. They were doing street theater. They held marches. They held rallies. Someone took over a Bank of America and renamed it the Food Bank of America, and they were serving free food to people. Right? There's an incredible wealth of diversity within nonviolence. And within diversity of tactics, one of the challenges with that is that there's not a baseline agreement. It's not grounded in principles. So someone at the General Assembly at Occupy Oakland once said, well, if we respect diversity of tactics, does that mean that we would also respect somebody kidnapping and murdering the children of corporate executives? Right? Because if we're saying we respect all diversity, all tactics, then it doesn't give us any sort of agreement on how far we're allowed to take that. And I think King would have found that problematic. And without being tied to a common set of principles, what happens is, King described it as moral relativism, right? That we're not grounded in some concrete morals, and we're not grounded in agreement saying this is right and this is wrong. And King believed that we can't be afraid to state our principles and to state our beliefs about what is right and what is wrong. And with that moral relativism, that moral ambiguity, we don't know where we stand on some important moral issues about how we carry about our work. Now, violence, I mean, it could work, right? Property destruction, I mean, who knows? Maybe if we break enough windows, someone will listen to us. But the problem is that Dr. King believed that the ends do not justify the means. He believed that the principles that support the type of society that we want to create, right? All the values that serve as the foundation of that vision, those values need to be reflected in the process of us getting there. We need to have means that are reflective of the ends. If we use fear and violence and intimidation to get what we want and to make the changes that we want in our society, that's what's going to be reflected in the changes that we create. Part of the problem is that in our society, we justify this belief that we can use fear and intimidation to just force our will over somebody, right? That's the problem. That's our enemy. That's what we're trying to change. This idea that we can just force our will on a community and take what we want. And to me, justifying the use of violence and fear and intimidation means that we're justifying that belief, saying it's okay to use fear and intimidation to make the changes we want in our society. I also want to talk about the role of direct action, because this is a movement that's very heavily focused on direct action. Dr. King believed, he believed in direct action, but he believed that there was a very specific role for direct action. He believed that conflict is resolved at the negotiating table. Conflict is resolved through dialogue. But sometimes in our dialogue, in our negotiations, there's a power imbalance, right? Someone has more power than another, so we can say, well, we've heard your concerns and we don't care. And so direct action is something that's used to put pressure on that system to balance the power dynamics. And it gives you leverage to go after negotiations, so you can actually get something out of it. So you gather the people, you mobilize the people to put pressure on the system so you can get more out of your negotiations. Now, the challenge with this movement is a lot of movements around the country have refused to negotiate. I heard that Occupy Providence was actually offered a permit and they refused, right? Occupy Oakland has a policy to not talk to the city. So without willing to talk to the powers, then I just don't understand how change is going to come. I don't think that if we yell loud enough, they're just going to give up all of their powers. I don't think that's how this works. And finally, the 99% concept, right? Initially, I thought it was brilliant because it ties so many different people together, so many different communities, so many different strategies. But I actually don't think King would have supported that framing. When he talked about the beloved community and wanting to build the beloved community, he was talking about a community where there's justice for all people, right? He said that a threat to justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. There were no exceptions, right? He didn't say a threat to justice anywhere except against these people is a threat to justice everywhere. So I don't think he would have supported the 99% framing, because I think his vision of the beloved community is about the 100%. I don't think this is a struggle between the 99% and the 1%. I think this is a struggle between the 100% and injustice. Right? King said that segregation wasn't an issue between black and white people. It was an issue between justice and injustice. So that's our enemy. Because let's be real, there's a whole lot of people in that 1% that support this movement. There's a lot of wealthy people that support this movement. And there's a whole lot of people in the 99% that want this movement to go away. There's a whole lot of people in the 99% that harm others, that benefit from that harm, right? There's a whole lot of people in the 99% that are just mean people. It's not about the 99% and the 1%, it's about fighting injustice, about the root causes. So, I know I'm almost out of time here, but So nonviolence is not just about not being violent, right? It's about being able to ground ourselves in some principles and know that the means that we use and the tactics that we use will be as pure as the vision that we, as the society that we want to create. The problem, one of the other problems with violent revolution is that at best, it will overthrow a government and change a system. But we have to remember that governments and laws and systems are things that we create as people. So if the people are still corrupt, they will corrupt any system. And violent revolutions may be able to change systems, but they're not going to change the values and the culture of this society, the culture that justifies the use of violence. Nonviolence can impact policy, but it can also change the hearts and minds of people. And at the end of the day, if we're not changing people, we can change all the laws and policies we want, and we'll always be fighting unjust laws and policies. With all the violence in Oakland, it's disturbing. And at the same time, every time there's instances of violence, it creates opportunities for nonviolent activists. Every time there's violence in Oakland, interest in nonviolence peaks. Because when we turned out those 100,000 or whatever amount of people it was in Oakland, the majority of those people want a nonviolent movement, as evidenced by the fact that these violent rallies, they dwindle in number every time. People are looking for an alternative. So I was sharing with some people earlier that we have a 2-day training in King and Nonviolence coming up in Oakland, and for the first time, we had to schedule a second training the following weekend to fill the overflow, and that overflow training is almost filled up and we're still 3 weeks away from it. And that's in addition to 2 more 2-day trainings that we're having in Oakland that we're not even allowed to publicize, because the people that organize the training feels like they can fill those 2 trainings just within their membership. There's a huge growing interest in King and Nonviolence, not just in Oakland. Right after this, I'm going to Seattle to do some work with the Occupy Oakland or Occupy Seattle folks, the Nonviolent Caucus there, because they're interested in it. And people are organizing around these principles in Phoenix and Tucson, all over the country. So I think, you know, the work that happens out of this room, out of this center, the Center for Peace and Nonviolent Studies, it's having a huge impact all across the nation. And I'm incredibly honored to be a part of that work. And this movement, it's only going to be successful if all of us are involved. It can't just be a young people's movement. It can't just be college students, right? It has to be college students and college faculties and colleges. It has to be city governments. It has to be churches. It has to be mosques. But it can't just be a young people's movement. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so honored to be here tonight, because of the commitment that URI has made to this movement and to this type of work and to the values that are reflective of Dr. King's teachings. I think that King spoke about the role of education being twofold. That one of the roles of education is to teach the math and the sciences and all that, but also that schools have a responsibility to teach morals and to teach ethics and to teach values. King said that the most dangerous man may be a man gifted with great reason and no morals. So the fact that the University of Rhode Island has committed to teaching King's legacy, I think shows the commitment that this university has in teaching ethics and to trying to change not just the educational system, but the value system of this country. So I think King would have been proud to have his name associated with a university like URI. So I think my time's up. Thank you all very much for having me. Again, it's a great honor.
You want to announce it? Okay.
Just thank you so much, Kazu. Remember, this isn't the end. This is just the beginning of Kazu's visit with us. And please, everyone who wants to hear more and also wants to engage more in some discussion and dialogue about these very important issues for economic justice and what's going to happen this year politically in the U.S., please come back at 4 o'clock today. There's an open community forum right here in the MCC, and Kazu will be, our head facilitator and leading that discussion in that community dialogue. So please join us then, 4 o'clock today in the forum.
Thank you so much, Paul. I'd like to also mention that anytime you're trying to thank people, there are always people you leave out. And thank heavens the program is long enough for me to include them. I'd like to acknowledge Abu Bakr, who is the new acting director of the Office of Community, Equity, and Diversity. And of course, I'd like to acknowledge my own personal dear friend, Dr. Robert Carruthers. At this time, I'm going to call Amy Olson forward once again. Amy, thank you so much for being willing to lead our closing number.
And I'd like to invite everyone to stand, and if you want to ring the room, or you can ring your table, but it's important to see if you can take hands with someone who is next to you.
Yeah. Let's see if we can make it. Well, let's go connect.
Can we just...
We're trying to link it together. Right on the left. I think we just about made it. Go, Amy. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday.
We shall live in peace.
We shall live in peace. We shall live in peace. We shall live in peace someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday.
We shall all be free.
We shall all be free. We shall all be free. We shall all be free someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday.
Go in peace.